chipsynth SFC。
Hey everyone, it's been a while since I've made a chipsynth SFC video. I wanted to make one pertaining to SNES samples and how to make them for a while. I just haven't had the chance, unfortunately. So today we're just going to go through the way you might want to make the sounds for your songs, keeping in mind that the SNES only had 64K of audio RAM. So the sounds had to be very short, as well as they had to have a lot of character and whatnot, because they also had to fit into an allotted amount of space. There is the fact that uploading samples to audio RAM can sometimes make the sounds slow the game down. A good example of that would actually be Street Fighter Alpha 2, where beginning of fights, it would load the actual like right here. So you can see that it's taking a long time to load it. People thought that it was the compression chip inside of the Street Fighter Alpha 2 cartridge for the Super Nintendo. It definitely wasn't. What was actually slowing down the game and giving it load times was uploading the samples into audio RAM. So you can see right there, it just cleared audio RAM, and now it loaded in the characters' voices and the announcer's voice.
Round one, fight!
And then it delays for about 5 seconds. I'm just going to pause it there because it clears out audio RAM again, loads in the appropriate character voices for the fight, as well as the background music. But if you listen to the background music, it sounds really bad because they had to use really short samples to fit the actual like characters' voices in there. And they're also very muddy. Yeah. So yeah, that's the one reason why Street Fighter Alpha 2 was really slow on the Super Nintendo. So you don't have to follow those rules if you don't want to, but if you're trying to achieve that Super Nintendo audio sound, you'll definitely want to try to get those shorter samples. So to do that, there's a number of different samples types that the SNES games used. One of the major ones, especially for Super Mario World, for example, let me load up some Super Mario World music, was what we call single cycle wave samples. I'll just load up Super Mario All-Stars. It's the same thing. So you can hear the bass here. I'm just going to grab that bass. If you look at the sample, let's get rid of the default wave. It's nothing more than a single cycle looped waveform. What that basically means is you might have a long waveform, but the waveform itself has cycles in it. As you can see, this has 2 cycles, but one of them are single looped. And if you do it in just the right way, you can get a perfectly in-tune pitched tone. What really made this hard back in the day was that you needed to loop it in terms of 16 samples. This is looped in 16 samples, but you don't really have to worry about that anymore because chipsynth SFC does resample everything for you when you import samples. So I'm going to do that in a moment, but I do want to talk about the other kinds of samples that you hear in these songs. So, for instance, you'll hear the steel drum here. So that's definitely not a single cycle sample. However, it is single cycle looped. If you look at it, you'll see that the transient here is the transient of the steel drum. But when it rings out, the loop itself right here is single cycle looped. So because it's single cycle looped, depending on the sample rate, sometimes you can't get it in perfect tune. But if you do it just right, you do get a perfectly tuned sample that plays forever. So I'll play this. And that was one of the hardest things to do. Of that 16 sample issue with the SPC 700, you can sometimes get samples that are out of tune. For the most part, most games on the SNES, you never really heard that because most musicians took care in the sounds that they put together. If you did hear that, then it just means that the audio engineer was working on it either didn't have good tools or they just didn't want to take the time to fix it. So yeah, you could basically do this. Like if you wanted to, for example, a lot of Super Mario World samples were recorded off of what we call romplers, but they're basically just sample units, like say the Roland S50. Well, that's a sampler, but Kurzweil K1200, for example, Final Fantasy IV uses that a lot. We'll be looking at some of those drums later on. But if you wanted to, you would normally do this in an audio editor, is edit out the beginning of the sample and then just have the loop. However, in chipsynth SFC, you can change the start of the sample and the end of the sample, and we can have a single cycle loop. So now imagine that steel drum as a single cycle sample. It almost sounds like an FM sound. Of course, if there's a little bit of a buzz, like this one kind of has a buzz, you can also change the X fade a little bit. If we change the start, that softens it up. You can also do pre-E, which is kind of like an EQ that brightens the sample to combat the Gaussian interpolation that the SNES uses. So that's another example. Let's do a Donkey Kong example. So for Donkey Kong Country 2, for example, there's a changing waveform in there. David Wise did load most, if not all, of the samples into audio RAM in most of the songs, which greatly reduced the load times. However, it also allowed him to be able to change a lot of the sounds on the fly. And because the game itself used very, very, very small samples, chipsynth SFC only has 16 slots for sounds, but he was able to load, I don't know, I think it was like 60 or 70 samples into memory. And because it was so small, he was able to fit multiple synthesized sawtooth resonant samples. So for example, if I play this song, you can hear that it's changing the pitch. If we look at the registers and the sample count here, you'll see that he's alternating samples to achieve that resonance. It's a really neat trick because it's doing it at every beginning of every note. You don't really notice that it's different samples. You think it's an actual filter suite. You can do that in chipsynth SFC. In fact, I actually included when I was beta testing, I was able to make a lot of presets that were included in the VST. But if you look at the presets underneath the sweep reso header, there's one called Saw Filter Q, and I modified it for this example. But as you can see, it's got a ton of different single cycle wave samples that change resonance on each step. And I also configured the matrix, as you can see here, to change the sample on every velocity change, just to make it easy to do that cycle. So I pre-made this part right here. As you can see, it's going to cycle the samples as the velocity goes higher. And if you were to do that, you'd probably want to shut off the velocity sensitivity so the volume doesn't change with it. But this is kind of an advanced example. You might not be able to do this unless you know the matrix very well. But that's the kind of thing that you can do with the samples. Like, it's still SNES music. It's just changing all the samples on the fly. So I've got Impulse Tracker up here really quick with some Final Fantasy VI samples loaded into it. I intentionally didn't loop the Final Fantasy VI oboe sound because I'm going to be using that in chipsynth SFC. But in your favorite sound editor, say SoundForge or Adobe Audition, chipsynth SFC can import samples that have loop points in them. So as long as your wave editor can save loop points, you can import them into chipsynth SFC, and then SFC will resample it so that it fits that 16 sample limitation of the SPC 700. But let's, right here, you can see that this already has a loop on it. So let's ignore that. Let's say I didn't know what the loop beginning was. I know what it is, but let's say I was looping something for the first time. What I'd want to do, in fact, let's just zero it out. So we have a sample that doesn't loop. If we go to turn on forwards, by default, you'll want to try to let the sample ring out as much as you can. But if you are trying to do a shorter sample and you're trying to save some memory, then what you could do is, let's say we change it to loop N705. So we're still getting the same flavor, but as you can see, the waveform is shorter. That might be hard to see, but right here where my mouse is moving up and down, that's where the end of the sound is. And we'll be doing that in chipsynth in a minute, but basically, if you have an audio editor that can set the loop points, then Impulse Tracker makes it easy. But if you do it that way, you can set the loop points by playing and turning on the loop. And an Impulse Tracker just plays it and updates it continuously. You might think that sounds like a good loop. And it would be a good loop if you cut the beginning of the sample off. I'm not going to do that because I can't load it again. And for all intents and purposes, that might be a sound you want to do. It's not tuned to C, of course, but once you import it into chipsynth SFC, it will automatically try to tune it. But let's try to fix this loop. Oops. Okay, so it was 704. Let's go 65. So 650. Okay, so it's not quite there, but you can tell we're getting close. Kind of sounds like a little bit like a bagpipe. We're just going to keep going until we hit the right pitch. Now I'm too high, so let's go down a bit. Perfect. And as you can see, we cut off a good, 2K off that sample. If I cut off the end, you'll see how short it is. And it sounds almost exactly like the same sample. So you can do the same thing in chipsynth SFC. Let's clear this. Let's just go to inits. Okay, so we'll start over from scratch, clear this off. And then I'm going to load a Final Fantasy VI song so I can grab that oboe. Okay, so we have that oboe sound now. It's right here. So if you know the loop points, like for instance, this was 2704, if I remember correctly, you can set the loop points, like I think it was 2656. No, it was 2655, wasn't it? Anyways, you can set the loop points by hand in chipsynth SFC. So it was 2656 actually. But if we go to 656 and then 704, and then 656, that shouldn't have worked. 656, 704. When I play this, it should be good. But it's not perfect. So there's that 16 byte sample, or 16 sample limit rather. So there's a couple ways you can fix this. You can either change the loop point to one below, 703, 702. There you go. Or you can go to 70. If you did put it at 703 and you didn't know it was wrong, you could try a crossfade and see if that fixes it. And it does, but it, as you can hear, it kind of puts it out of tune. So you'd want to go back to 702. Yep. 704 rather. 702. Yeah, 702. So those are basically short samples. You could definitely make your own sounds to do stuff like that. In fact, we can do that really quick. Just keeping on the example of the oboe, I'm going to take the S50 oboe, which I have loaded into Contact right now. As you might be able to tell, it's actually the same sound that Final Fantasy VI got its oboe from. So that was the same sample right there. But let's change it up a bit. Let's try this one right here. So I'm going to try doing this completely within my own DAW, which I'm using as Cakewalk. So let's make a note. That's good enough. And then what I'm going to do is export audio to my music work SPC FF6. We'll just say new oboe. The keen-eared person might notice that the sample I am sampling right now is actually used in Final Fantasy V. Okay, so I'm just going to load that sample that I just bounced. Music work SPC FF6. I already forgot what I called it. Oh, I called it new oboe, didn't I? I got a lot of files in this folder. I should probably clean it up a bit. There it is, new oboe. So I'm going to drag it here. As you can see, looks and sounds good. Now I can do that whole thing that I was talking about, like I can close it, do whatever I want. Because I'm trying to fight the interpolation again, the Gaussian interpolation of the SNES, I'm going to turn on pre-E. It's hard to hear, but it did brighten up the sample a bit. But as you can see, it's way too long. Like it's actually, how much RAM is that using? It's using 34% of my audio RAM already, which is crazy. I might have echo set, or maybe I don't. Yeah, I have level 5, so that's about 32K. But it's still using a ton of memory for that sample. So what I'll do is I'll turn on the loop. Now this is going to be a little bit harder because the audio looping editor in chipsynth SFC isn't as robust. So as you can hear, I got very close, but I can fix it by, let's see. Pitch is going down, which means I need to close the loop a little bit to make it faster. So let's go 3414. Still a little bit of a pitch issue, so 3415. Perfect. And as you can hear, sounds great, but if what I want to do is maybe drag it over a bit. Not that, well, let's hear what that sounds like. Sounds really thin when you loop something that's that fast. But, I mean, based on what we just did here, we single cycle looped it. You can see the ARAM 17%. Sorry, you just heard somebody subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you, whoever that was. But anyways, yeah, so if we... Changing the end doesn't really change the ARAM because technically, when you change the end loop point, it cuts the rest out of memory anyways. So if this was going on real hardware, we'd be saving a lot of space right now. But we did sample it at what, 44.1, like 40, basically CD audio quality. That's still gonna limit our pitch. We're not gonna be able to go very high pitched with it before the pitch starts to wrap over. So what we'd want to do is decimate it, maybe decimate it by half. Still sounds about the same, but as you can probably hear, our pitch range goes way up. And as you could probably tell, I think that is the Final Fantasy V oboe. I'm just going to double check. So as you can hear, a lot of Final Fantasy games sampled from Roland S50s, and I guess that Roland sample is pretty common on other Roland units and such. So now we know how to make samples, at least short samples. It gets a little bit more complicated, especially when you have things like strings. So let's do a string sample really quick. I got a Kurzweil K1200 string. which is basically the EMU2 strings. They do come with chipsynth SFC. In fact, you know what? Screw it. Let's use a chipsynth SFC sample. So we'll go into a bowed string, and I forget which one it is. Maybe it's mod Marco 2. Yeah, it's basically the same string that Final Fantasy VII used, but this one's sounds like it's got a really high pass filter on it. So it sounds good, but it looks like we didn't loop it, so let's loop it. Again, this is an SNES sample, so if we wanted the full one, we can use it. However, actually what we might want to do is lower the gain, decimate it a bit, which is going to kind of compress it, but it's also going to lower the quality so it doesn't sound as harsh. There we go. And then what we want to do is loop it. We don't want to make it too long, but when you're looping things like strings, what you want to do is try to find dips in the waveform, like about there. And then let's try, it might be too short. Let's try it about here. Already that's a good loop. So we already have our strings. So a lot of the time, the games will actually cut the beginning of the sample for the strings out too. So they'll go like this, and then you'll hear things like, or if you're Chrono Trigger, you might throw, say, an attack of 8 on it. And let's say you have a sample that doesn't loop well. So let's make sure, let's see if we don't loop this correctly. So you'll hear a click in this one. So you might not like that, of course. Why would you? It doesn't sound very good. If you have enough real estate, what you could try to do is use the crossfade. You can't really see it because I'm cutting this beginning of the sample off, but as you can see, it's highlighting a bit outside of the loop point. So now it's going to try to fade the waveform in on top of itself so that it doesn't click. And a lot of audio editors like SoundForge have an option like that, like a crossfade option for the loop, so that you can get better looping sounds. But for the most part, you might have to do that by hand, and it's kind of a pain. So if you are not very good in an audio editor and whatnot, chipsynth SFC's like sample editor makes it really easy. This video is going a little longer than I hoped, but let's speed it up just a little bit. So let's try crash cymbal. Crash cymbals are one of the hardest things to loop on a Super Nintendo. I like this sound. It sounds almost like Final Fantasy IV's crash. So as you can hear, it's looped already, but if let's say you have a crash, as you can see, the waveform is uniform here, but what if you have a crash that isn't uniform? That's a little bit harder, so you'd probably want to bring that into an audio editor. I brought in a crash sample from the Kurzweil K1200. So here's a Kurzweil crash. It's a lot harder, as you could see in the original sample. This isn't the same crash, but it's more uniform, it's more flat. In this one, it's not. So what you'd want to do, especially if you're trying to have an ADSR control your waveform, is you're going to have to learn how compression works. So when you go to, say, your DAW's compressor, you can go to the dynamics section. So we want to try to keep the threshold not too low, otherwise it'll distort, and the ratio somewhat high. Like, we want to be able to keep the attack of the waveform, but we want to keep the rest of it kind of uniformly flat. So let's change the ratio. 8 is okay. I'm going to change the attack. It doesn't seem like it's going to be very much of an attack, but we'll see what happens. And the release, we're just going to slow it down so that it keeps the waveform pretty much uniform, as uniform as we can. So when I hit apply, it's a little bit too flat actually. Yeah, I didn't like that. Didn't think I would like that compressor. Let's try this one. So same thing. Let's turn the threshold down a little bit. Turn the attack, because you want a slow attack for stuff like this. So slow attack, maybe about 150 milliseconds should be okay. A long release and a semi-high, like maybe 8 or 9 of a ratio. Apply. So it's kind of what I'm looking for, but I think my threshold was too low. So let's turn up the threshold a little bit. Okay. And this is the thing, is you'll have to play with the settings a little bit to get the rate that you want. My attack might be too slow too, so let's turn that down. A little bit slower attack, a little bit higher ratio, a little bit more, sorry, higher threshold, a little bit higher ratio. Okay, I think my ratio is too high now. Apply. So of course, the goal is to try to flatten the waveform out as much as you can without losing the attack. This looks okay, but I think I'm going to raise this up and match it a little bit more. Now you got to be careful about what I just did, because sometimes you'll have dips like right here and it might not sound good. And I think that sounds okay. Okay, so that crash definitely sounds compressed. Now you have the option of editing it short here by cutting out the rest, or just leaving it the way it is. Just keep in mind, the longer the samples, the more amount of long samples you have in chipsynth SFC, the more of a chance it's going to slow down. So usually I just end up editing it. So the part that you'd want to pay attention to is this part right here. You can hear that it's the initial transient is ringing out. So the idea is to try to loop it like that. Now, I'm not 100% sure if the looping will work in Adobe Audition. Every time I try it, it doesn't seem to work because it doesn't have a loop marker, but let's try that and just see what happens. Marker 1. If anything, I'll at least get the sample so I know where it's at. So let's change this to samples. Okay, so I got it starting at 12, 1, 2, 2, 5, 3. Okay, so I'm going to save my sample. Let's just go crash. Go back to Cakewalk. Let's clear this. We don't want that one. And I'm just going to load that sample that I just made. Oops, SF2. I already forgot the name of it. There we go. Yeah, see, it didn't save the looping information. So I'll just turn loop on again. I already forgot what it was. 1, 2, 2, 5, 3. So I'll just copy and paste it into here. See, it's not even the same. It compressed it. That's okay. No, it didn't. I'm just dumb. 1, 2, 2, 5, 3. There we go. So now we have the same loop point. Again, if you can't get it to loop properly, you can try the X-Fade option. You might even want to try the X-Fade option, because it might smooth it out a bit. For the most part, this sounds like a pretty decent crash. I'm going to turn on pre-E again. And then I'm going to decimate it because it's a little bit too crisp. That sounds good. So if we listen to, say, Chrono Trigger's Crash Cymbal, I'm just going to pull up a Chrono Trigger song. So it's the same kind of thing. It loops quick. As you can see, about a flat waveform. In fact, I could probably make mine smaller and okay, and they're using a envelope of D17, a D2 envelope of D17. So I'll do the same thing. Yeah. There you go. Turn up the decim just a bit. And it's something you want to play around with. Like, that might sound a little bit too mechanical. If you have it spread out a little bit more, you'll get the effect you're probably looking for. But again, keep in mind, crash cymbals couldn't be very long on the Super Nintendo. Otherwise, it would eat your memory. And in the context of a mix, you might not even hear that looping. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is drum editing. So I have been using the Kurzweil K1200 as an example here, mostly because it's the same synthesizer Final Fantasy IV got its drums from. So you can hear there's a hi-hat, pedal hi-hat. Sample's not used. There we go. This is a great example. So Final Fantasy IV uses this hard snare drum sound. Oops. Let's load it up in here. I'm just going to clear everything we did. Then we'll load Final Fantasy IV. It would have been Fight 2. So let's compare that sample. Oh, that's a kick drum. I want the snare drum. Okay. Final Fantasy IV also uses the kick drum from the Kurzweil K1200, so I just forget where it is. There it is. But as you could probably hear, oops. I always forget the sample names. Let's listen to the timbre of the sound. So you can see that the SNES one snaps a bit, and it also sounds really crisp compared to the original. It's also shorter. This one rings out a little bit more. And the beginning's not as compressed as it is here. You can see that Uematsu, or whoever did the sound engineering for Final Fantasy IV, I think it could have been Minoru Akao, but anyways, it's distorting a little bit, or at least it's flattening the waveform so it's limited, so that the impact of the sound can overpower the instrumentation that is used. Wrong sound. So this one's deeper, has more bass, has less high end, and it's more compressed. Let's see if we can effectively at least get close to it. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to lower the threshold of the compressor, turn the ratio up, attack up. What this is going to do is it's going to let the beginning ring out. Good. And then what I want to do is hard limit it. So maximum amplitude is just below digital distortion. I'm going to boost it by about 6 decibels. Look ahead, release time. Okay. Not quite enough. So just one more time. Perfect. As you can see, everything changed except the attack. The attack's a little bit more compressed. Yeah, and it sounds way more gated. Now, the other thing what we'll try to do to match that sound is We want to change the EQ, so parametric EQ. Let's do a high shelf filter. And a low shelf filter too is fine. There we go. Notice how the more higher frequencies there are, the thicker the waveform. Actually, it's not really. I think it's just because the higher frequencies mean that it looks more dense because, you know, the higher the frequencies you have, the faster they go. That's pretty close. So now the next thing what we want to do is say, try to match the length of it. So Final Fantasy IV cuts off maybe about that much. And if you notice, it also dips in amplitude right in the end of the waveform. So we're going to do the same thing. Let's make it not loop. It's still too long, so we'll shorten it up a bit. It sounds good, but it also sounds a little bit too compressed now. What I'll do is I'll take my fader, just fade it out just a wee bit. Maybe that didn't work. I'll try a gain envelope. Gain. Good. And let's move this down here. So I'm going to put the node. So that's 0. Let's move this back to 0. That way I don't change. Even just a little bit lower is fine. And then I'm just going to do this. Maybe negative. Yeah, that should be fine. I don't want to change it too much. I just want to change it just a little bit. That sounds good. So we're going to say this is hard snare, H snare, and let's refresh, and we'll load up that sample. I just want to see how close we get. It's pretty close. You can hear this is just a little bit thinner with a little bit less bass. But I have no doubt if I threw that into a Final Fantasy IV track and told you I swapped the sample, you probably wouldn't have noticed it. So that's pretty much it. I might expand on this idea a little bit more in the future, but I didn't mention this in the past part of the video, but my other video corrupted. If you have any ideas, or like if you're a SNES musician and you have any tips or tricks, feel free to post them in the comments. I'd love to read them. I wouldn't mind commenting on some myself. And then, yeah, it would be cool to talk about this. Maybe we can do a follow-up on this a little bit more too. I want to do some more chipsynth SFC quote-unquote tutorials. I wouldn't really call this a tutorial. It's more of an explanation. Yeah, I kind of want to do a sound effects one so that you know how to make SNES style sound effects. And there was some other stuff I wanted to talk about before I ended this chipsynth SFC series. Anyways, yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. If you haven't already, subscribe. I'm going to have a lot more content. As you could probably see, I'm posting every day. And yeah, if you want to throw me a few bucks, you know, buy me a coffee or something once every month on Patreon, I'm totally down for that. You get access to my lossless blacks for any of the SNES restorations that I make. Plus, you'll be happy to know that I'm doing stuff that I'll be able to continue doing stuff I like doing. Hopefully you guys like watching me do. So we'll see you again soon, and thanks so much for dropping by. If you have any questions again, let me know, and I'll definitely expand on it for sure. Okay, guys, see you later. Bye.